In many ways, the natural language interface to large language models via chat is one of the more interesting aspects of using these systems because you can put in something that's a little bit sloppy, like, hey, clean up this text and remove all of the commas, or convert this from a plain text to a markdown format, right? There's some benefits to this, but once you start to get into programming where you're doing software engineering, it starts to become a liability. And I think this is one area that is worth discussing for a little bit. When you're dealing with using large language models for automation, do you care about using natural language, or are you more interested in making things deterministic? So the benefits in many ways to natural language is that you can, put in all kinds of different queries that are somewhat similar and get, you know, random or reasonably random results as a result of the query you put in with English. But the problem with this is if you're building tools like a command line tool, a serverless a function, or some kind of batch processing system, do you really want natural language as the interface to talking with large language models? You can see this with languages like AppleScript, for example, where it's kind of tempting to want to use an English type language if you've ever played around with this scripting language on the Apple ecosystem or OS 10. But likewise, there's been higher level languages on Windows as well. Uh, Visual Studio has enabled people to build things with high level languages as well. But if you dive into the details, one of the problems is that they really start to struggle with how do you express logic, but also interface with human language. And that's been the weak point of these languages that are these like high level scripting languages. So when we look at large language model, it's even further accelerated because many people that are using a chat interface like ChatGPT or Claude or DeepSeek, they are thinking of things not as a software engineer, they're thinking of things as a human who maybe doesn't have software engineering background, so they don't know about for loops or about mutability or what a function is, and so they can get themselves into trouble where maybe they ask a question and then it's different every time they ask because they change some slight behavior. So this is really the essence of the problem with dealing with large language models is it possible to make things more deterministic? So one of the ways you can do this is to treat the input to a large language model as code. And so one way to do this would be to use an interface like YAML. Now, why would YAML be a great way to talk to a large language model? Well, YAML is essentially a JSON data structure. JSON is like Python. It's like a Python dictionary. Uh, and if you look at JSON, it's mostly intuitive, right? There's a key and some values, but it's not perfectly human readable. It's somewhat human readable, but YAML makes it even a little bit better at being human readable, but it's still this key value type structure. So you see YAML a lot with build systems. So the Google Cloud or GitHub has GitHub Actions, or Amazon has Code Build. Their build system uses YAML. Essentially, almost every build system that's a commercial or open source type build system uses some form of YAML because it's a good interface that allows you to have a strict data structure that you can lint. So you can lint the YAML, but you also can treat it more like a coding input. And so I think this is where I'm starting to see some traction with making things more deterministic and making automation a better part of the workflow, is that instead of just thinking of things with some random bunch of text you put into a Google Doc somewhere, or a file that you keep prompts, you start to think about things in a YAML format. Once it's in a YAML format, then you can start to write code around it. For example, with a Rust project, you could have a directory full of prompts, and those prompts could all be validated, linted, and you've run some unit tests against them where you're able to actually get fairly deterministic behavior out of that because there's a prompt template, and inside of there you have certain sections that get filled out. And if you run different kinds of fuzz testing against it, you could get a pretty deterministic scenario as a result. So I think this is something to consider when you're thinking about taking large language models to the next step, especially when they're running local with, let's say, Olama or some other local tool, maybe Rust Candle or Llama file, is that you can think of how do I make this more deterministic so I can do traditional software engineering best practices. And what I've discovered is that YAML could be a good place to start. So if you're interested in doing this kind of automation, take a look at YAML, try to make your inputs deterministic, run some tests on it, and give it a try.